If this is your first time here, welcome. One thing you need to know about Paradox that is different than other churches is that sermons here are designed to start discussions, not end them. It's okay if you disagree with what I say. This is not meant to be an authoritative word on what everyone here believes. Instead, it's meant to help you think critically about what you believe so that you can become a more loving person, loving toward yourself, loving toward others, and loving toward God. So with that in mind, we will go to Luke chapter 22 and tell a story toward the end of Christ's life. We pick up the story shortly after the Last Supper. And after this Last Supper, Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane and he prays with his disciples. He asks his disciples to pray with him, but they fall asleep. They can barely stay awake. And while he is waking them up, one of his disciples, whom many people consider to be the worst disciple, Judas Iscariot, betrays him with a kiss, and the temple officials then arrest him. Yes, the temple officials, the church people, go and arrest Jesus. While Jesus is arrested and on trial, his best disciple, Peter, denies him 3 times. And after he is denied 3 times by his best disciple, Jesus is then flogged by the religious institution and then brought before the religious leaders, the chief priests and the scribes, and asked some questions in an interrogation. So imagine you all of a sudden get dragged into a room filled with pastors, and they're going to start questioning you about your theology, and you have to answer correctly or you might die. That's essentially what's happening here. And so we read in Luke chapter 22, in front of these religious leaders, when the day came, the assembly, I should say when they came. I'm not sure how that snuck in there. When they came, the assembly of the elders, no, it is day. It's the day of the morning. I gotcha. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, if you are the Messiah, tell us. We keep hearing rumors that you are the Messiah, the chosen one. If you are, just tell us, yes or no. And Jesus is like, I'm not going to do that. Jesus replies, if I tell you, you will not believe, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated on the right hand of the power of God. And if you're confused by the answer, so are the chief priests and scribes. They respond by saying, so are you the Son of God then? And Jesus responds by saying, you say that I am. And that's all that these chief priests and scribes need to hear. They respond by saying, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. And this was incriminating enough that they go from the religious institution to the institution of the state, headed up by a Roman citizen, a man named Pilate, and they bring him before Pilate in another interrogation, saying this man is an enemy of the state. And the charges they bring against Jesus are found in the second verse of chapter 23, when the religious leaders began to accuse him, saying, we found this man perverting our nation. Now, you know that you cannot bring an accusation of saying this man perverted our nation, so that's why he should be put to death. So they then add a specific charge beyond that. They say, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor. Now, if you've been reading the Gospel of Luke up until this point, you can only respond to this charge with 2 words. Hold up, hang on. That's not true. Because a few chapters to the left is Luke chapter 20. And in Luke chapter 20, just 3 chapters before this story unfolds, we come across another story where we hear about people going before Jesus and asking him about taxes. We read in Luke chapter 20, so they asked him. And you may ask, who is they in this story? Well, it's the chief priests and scribes who 3 chapters later are going to interrogate Jesus. They ask him about taxes because they want him to die. So they're like, okay, how can we get him to do this? Well, if he refuses to pay taxes, the Romans don't like that. So let's go down that road. So they asked Jesus, teacher, we know that you are right what you say and teach, and you show deference to no one, but teach the way of God in accordance with truth. Is it lawful to pay taxes to the emperor or not? Give us a yes or no answer, Jesus. Now, they ask this very important question point blank because they're hoping Jesus will say yes and alienate the zealots, the revolutionaries, or Jesus will say no, and then he's gone forever. So Jesus responds by saying, oh, I perceive your craftiness. And he says to them, show me a denarius. Now, a denarius is a day's wage in Jesus' day and age. So they bring forward a denarius, and he holds it up, and he says, whose head and whose title does it bear? Now, the religious leaders look at this and they say, the emperors? And Jesus responds with a brilliant answer when he says, then give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and give to God the things that are God's. That's a good answer, right? So when we read this passage and these religious leaders are like, he forbade us to pay taxes to the emperor, you should say, hold up, this right here is a lie. This is a lie, and it's a major problem. And when we consider who they are in this passage, it's the religious leaders. And what do the religious leaders do in Jesus' day and age? Well, very clearly, they uphold the law of Moses. And the most famous laws of Moses are without a doubt the 10 commandments. And number 9 of those 10 commandments is, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. These religious leaders are supposed to be experts in following this law. And here they are before the governor saying, we're going to bear false witness. And you ask them, if you could ask them, why is that? They would say, well, we're trying to kill this person, which is a violation of the 6th commandment. So they're now violating commandment on top of commandment, and this right here is bearing false witness. You have to feel a little bit of betrayal on Jesus' part when you read this story, right? Because these are the people who are supposed to follow the laws, and they are breaking the laws to hurt Christ. Now, they don't just stop with that. They go on to say these words. He also has said that he himself is the Messiah, a king. And if you've been reading the story up until this point, you respond with 2 words. Hold up. Did he actually say that? Because you can just go back a few verses ago that we just read and read these words. All of them ask, are you then the Son of God? He said to them, you say that I am. And they responded by saying, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. And I respond to this by saying, did you? Did you really hear him say that he is the Son of God? Because all he said was, you say that I am. And when they go before Pontius Pilate, the governor, and they say, he has claimed to be the Messiah, another king, he is threatening your power, he's about to spark a revolution, they are, once again, bearing false witness, breaking the 9th commandment in an effort to break the 6th commandment to eliminate the threat of Jesus. Now, this is a real moment that we got to stop at and pay attention to what's going on here, because you have all these religious leaders who, once again, are concerned with keeping the law of Moses first and foremost. And when you think about what they're doing, it's almost like there's a question that we have to ask in the way that they went before Pilate and what they did. The question we should ask is, what are the worst things that people could tell the governor about Jesus? Because what do the Romans care about, right? There are really only 2 things that are really bad that they could say about Jesus to the Roman governor. The first thing is, Jesus opposes taxes, because the Romans love taxes, right? The second thing is, Jesus says he's a king, and he's trying to spark a revolution. And when you look at who the Romans are, they really only care about 2 things, money and power. And as long as you don't disrupt those things, they kind of leave you alone as long as your taxes come in on time and you're compliant. So here's the religious institution saying, what's the worst thing we could say about Jesus to the governor of Judea? And they came up with it. Now, I assume that Pilate has access to some records about whether or not Jesus has paid his taxes or not. And he probably thinks to himself, I don't need to check this, because if this man wasn't paying taxes, he'd already be arrested and dead. Like, that's how our government works. But on the second claim, he decides to launch a thorough investigation. It's almost like Pontius Pilate thinks to himself, I'm going to get to the bottom of this, whether or not Jesus is a king. And the next verse launches the investigation. We read, Pilate asked him, so are you the king of the Jews? Jesus answered, you say so. And that's the end of the investigation. We read, Pilate said to the chief priests in the crowd, I find no basis for an accusation against this man. There's nothing you can do. These aren't things that he actually committed. These are bearing false witnesses. Now from there, Pilate sends him to the king of Judea, which is Herod. He's a puppet king. Herod sends him back to Pilate. This results eventually in Jesus' crucifixion, but we want to stop right here for a moment and get to Pilate's answer. I find no basis for an accusation against this man. There are two things that have been said about him that simply are not true. And if we stop here, I think there's a lot that we can learn about how to become more loving people in response to this story. To talk about those two different ideas of what we can learn from this story, I want to talk to you about the stories of Jesus. Because there's something about the stories of Jesus that Christians love, obviously, because we call ourselves Christians. And what I have found is that there are people who will read the stories of Jesus and always identify with Jesus in the story. That's a bit of a problem. Conversely, the other side that's a problem is people who read the stories of Jesus and they never identify with Jesus in the story. It's important for all of us to understand when we read the stories of Jesus today, I personally have found it helpful to identify both as the people around Jesus and also as Jesus. The people around Jesus represent finite human beings, right? They're imperfect, they make mistakes. I remind myself that I'm part of that group. But at the same time, I'm also made in the image of Christ, just like all of you are as well. So there's part of your story in the life of Christ as well. And when you consider this story, it teaches us a lot if we consider this story from two different angles, both from the people around Christ, and we identify those people, and also when we identify as Christ in this story and see what it is that we can learn from that perspective, because they are both our stories. So let's start with the identifying as Jesus first, shall we? Now here we have this idea that the religious folks tell the worst kind of lies they could tell about the governor, about Jesus. And it's here that we see this and we see how it unfolds and we're saying to ourselves, man, can you imagine being Christ in that moment? To hear these false accusations thrown your way, how would it feel if I was there in that moment? And so I want to ask you this morning, have you ever had terrible, untrue things said about you? Yeah, you can feel the weight of that question, can't you? It hurts, it stings, and it even burns. And we have a word for this in the English language. That word is gossip. Now, it may seem like a stretch to go from a legal proceeding to the word gossip, but when you look at the dictionary definition of gossip, I actually think it fits in this category. Gossip is casual or unconstrained conversation or reports about other people, typically involving details that are not confirmed as being true. So in my opinion, this falls under the category of gossip. And when we ask the question, have you ever had someone spread terrible gossip about you? The response that we typically have when this happens is we start asking a question. Why is this happening to me? We ask this question to see if there's anything in our past that would lead to this gossip being spread around. And we say to ourselves, okay, if there's something that I did that's causing all of this pain and all of this heartache, then I should probably acknowledge it so I can make amends or so I can do something right. And yet when we look at it, we go back and we say like, oh, if I would have had this conversation differently, or if I would have done this thing different, oh man, then I think we could have gone around this and those people would not be saying terrible things about me. But when you look at what gossip truly is, it involves things that simply are not true. And when you look at the story of Jesus Christ, we have to remind ourselves that this is the Son of God. And what this story teaches us is that even if you act like Jesus Christ every day, people will still spread gossip about you. Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe you do not deserve the gossip that is being spoken about you. And if you've ever asked the question, why is this person saying this thing? Why is that person attacking me? Why does that person ruin my reputation? Maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's just the fact that people are spreading rumors and they just pass them along without another thought. And the story of Jesus teaches us that maybe it's not actually tied to your behavior every time. Maybe it's just people spreading gossip. If anybody here has wondered why and asked the question, why are these words being spread about me? May I tell you, you may not deserve it. It may just be human nature. It doesn't tie to your behavior. Which brings us to the second perspective we need to consider when telling this story, which is we got to look at the people around Jesus to see how they acted with gossip. Because when it comes to gossip, this is a story about religious people, which you're in church, so you're one of us now. How religious people react and embrace gossip and what it does to them, okay? Now, we now have the scientific method, so we've learned a lot about gossip since Jesus' time. There was a research study done about 10 years ago by Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett out of Northeastern University in Boston. She wanted to understand how gossip affects who we are and how we perceive the people around us. She writes this before her study was published. She said, gossip is helping you to predict who is friend and who is foe. So there's actually a useful function behind it. She's saying from an evolutionary perspective, gossip helps you to label whether or not someone is a threat or someone will help you. And so that's why we are drawn to it very quickly. Now, to do her research, she did something that is really fascinating to me. She had research subjects come in and she showed them pictures of faces. When she showed them pictures of faces, she added a little bit of information about the face. Now, this wasn't actually real, it wasn't tied to the person, but she was telling this narrative to tie a story to the face that research subjects were seeing. This can be as benign as passed a man on the street or had a root canal performed, or it can be as generous as somebody saying they helped an elderly woman with her groceries. Now, interspersed with those were some negative things or negative gossip about people as well. For instance, they showed this face and they said he threw a chair at his classmate. Now, from there, they then looked at all these pictures. They tried to remind the people of who they saw and what the facts were about them. And then they led them into another room where they showed two images side by side, something like this. On one side was a face, and on the other side was something benign, like a house or a cat or a car. Now, when the research subjects sat down, they would sit down in a way that there was a divider between their two eyes. So one eye couldn't see one side and one eye couldn't see the other side. Now, in the psychology community, I am told that this is called binocular rivalry. And what it means is that the two eyes can't focus on both things at once, so the brain only processes one thing, and it's not really up to you what the brain processes. And what they found is that when somebody had something positive associated with them, and they said this person helped an elderly woman with her groceries, they would then bring the research subject into the lab, and they would ask them behind this screen, they would say, which one do you see? Do you see the house, or do you see the face? And if it was positive, they found that people responded by saying, oh, I see a house. However, if they showed a negative person or someone who had been gossiped about, they sat them there and they say, what do you see, a house or a face? People responded by saying, I see a face. And what the research concluded was that gossip doesn't just influence your opinions about people, it actually influences how you see them visually. Their face looks different once you've heard gossip. Now, upon hearing this, I know someone who would stand up and say, this is so true. Craig Hadley. I have lived this story. And I'm going to tell you a story that doesn't make me look real good, okay? And I just want to own that up front, but it's a story that taught me a lot about gossip, and I want to share with you this morning. Now, I have to tell you, there are people in this story who are real people. I have changed all their names. And before you start thinking, oh, I think he's talking about that person over there, they don't go to Paradox. So let's just all stop that right now. So the story begins, Kimmy and I have two friends who we will call Chad and Connie. Now, Chad and Connie are about anywhere from 5 to 20 years older than us. So we kind of view them as people who've always been nice to us. They've been very generous to us in bringing us into their home several times for lunch. And we've just really enjoyed them as friends who are a little bit more toward the mentor side of our life. Now, we also have a friend that does not know Chad and Connie, who we will call Ava. So we are friends with Ava, but Ava does not know Chad and Connie. And Ava has a friend we've never met before. We will call him Blake. So one day, Kimmy and I were hanging out with Ava, and we were talking about things, and then all of a sudden, Ava started talking about Chad and Connie. This was interesting because Ava didn't know Chad and Connie. And Ava leaned over to us and she said, hey, let me tell you what I heard. Blake told me that Chad is cheating on Connie. Now, Kimmy and I responded by going, what? That's mind-blowing. Chad and Connie seem so happy all the time. I can't imagine Chad cheating on Connie. And we talked about it and kind of the implications for it, and we were kind of fascinated by it. When Ava left, my wife and I were like, wow, that'd be really crazy, huh? Really interesting. 2 weeks later, Connie calls us and says, hey, do you and Kimmy want to come over for lunch for this weekend? And we say, of course we do. This is not something out of the ordinary. We go over there, and we don't talk much about the rumor that we heard or the gossip that we heard. We just go over there thinking this will be a normal conversation, normal dinner with Chad and Connie. So we go over there, we walk in, the door is opened, and Connie answers the door, and we've discovered that Chad is not there. So upon seeing that Chad is not there, Connie says, oh, Chad's running late. We can start without him. Now, on the outside, what I did was like, oh, that's great. Okay, well, we'll have lunch. On the inside, I thought this, oh, sure, Chad's running late. So we're sitting there, we're talking to Connie, like, I'm just like trying my best not to mention Chad at all. And then Chad, about 20 minutes later, walks in. He's got this big smile on his face, and he says, hey, sorry I'm late. It's so good to see you, Craig and Kimmy. Now, I responded by saying, it's so good to see you, Chad. Oh, man, we've missed you. And on the inside, I'm thinking, and where have you been, Chad? So we're sitting there, we're talking, we're going back and forth, we're sharing lunch, there's stories that are going around. And then Chad, there's a lull in the conversation. Chad says, so you want to know where I was? I just got back from flying airplanes with my friend. Do you want to see a video I took? And we on the outside are like, yeah, sure, show us a video. So he passes us this video, and it's a video, Chad's not in it. It's just a video outside of an airplane window of like the ground passing below. And on the outside, I'm telling Chad, oh, this is great, how cool is this? And on the inside, I'm thinking, this video is probably fake. Chad, I need you with a newspaper in the cockpit from today's date to verify that you were actually in that airplane. And so we're having lunch, we're still having a great time, we leave, there's some pleasantries exchanged, Kimmy and I go, and we walk back to our car, and we sit down, and we close the doors, and once we're sure that we're in a soundproof place, I lean over to Kimmy and I was like, you would not believe what happened to me. Like, this is all involuntary, Kimmy. When Connie told us that Chad was running late, you know what I thought? She's like, what? I said, well, I thought, oh, sure, Chad's running late. And Kimmy's mouth dropped and she said, that's exactly what I thought. And she's like, you know what I thought? She tells me, she's like, you know what I thought? When Chad came in late and he said, sorry, I'm late. You know what I thought, Craig? I thought, and where have you been, Chad? I'm like, that's the same thing. It's the same thing. And I said, oh, and you know, Kimmy, when he showed us that video of the airplane, she said, oh yeah, that was totally a fake. I couldn't believe it. We had the exact same thoughts without talking about any of this ahead of time. And we just kind of sat there in the car and we're like, whoa, this gossip sticks like Velcro in our brains. Wow. And when a researcher in Boston's like, this will change the way you look at other people, I was shocked because we have this idea that gossip is something junior high kids struggle with, right? And what we found is that we have this idea that we grow out of detrimental effects of gossip. But I have to tell you something as a personal testimony. Even if you are an ordained minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ with a master's of divinity degree, you are not immune to the detriment of gossip. You do not grow out of it. The only difference is you rationalize it more. And I could not believe how much our perception of Chad completely changed from someone telling us something about Chad that we knew but had never met Chad, from someone we didn't even know. Why does Blake's opinion influence how we understand our friend? And the only way to really deal with this is to be aware of it. We often tell ourselves that we're above this, but we aren't. We're human beings. We have been trained from an evolutionary perspective to stick to gossip as much as possible. But then you hear stories like this, and I hope you say, whoa, I'm not sure that should change my relationship with Chad. I'm not sure that should change how I see this person. And the stunning part of this story to me is that this gossip is spread by the very people who should be denouncing this gossip, by the religious people. And when we talk about what our two commandments here are at Paradox from Jesus Christ, we have to talk about that they prioritize, these two commandments prioritize that we should love God and love others. And my friends, if we are serious about becoming more loving people, then we must become experts in our ability to squash gossip. We must be really good at it. This is what we need to learn how to do to become more loving people. Now, ways that you can respond to gossip about people that you've heard is you can respond by saying, wow, that doesn't sound like them at all. I know Chad. It seems like he really likes his wife. And they would respond by saying, have you been with Chad everywhere? Of course I haven't. But why wouldn't I give Chad the benefit of the doubt if I'm trying to be a more loving person? Another way you can respond to gossip is you can respond by saying, where did you hear that from? Well, I heard it from Blake. Why is Blake gonna take control of my mind and influence this relationship I have in my life? Another way to respond is, there are probably two sides to this story. Maybe Blake really loves Connie and is trying to win her away from Chad. I don't know. But that's another way to respond, because otherwise we just leave it out there. And another way to respond is, if we were really close to Chad, like more close than we actually are, I could go to them and say, I'll ask them myself. Now you have to be really close to ask about cheating, let me tell you that. But if you're close enough on other matters, you can go and talk to them yourself. Now these aren't the answers, this isn't the right way to do everything, I get that, right? The more important part is that we've got to become experts in squashing gossip, because gossip can completely change the way you see people who bear the image of Christ. And if we're talking about this church and why it exists, to see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, then you can see how gossip gets in the way of that work. My friends, when we squash gossip, it is an act of love. May we love others extravagantly by putting an end to gossip. And may you see and embrace Jesus Christ in all, even if it's putting an end to a rumor. Amen.